Hi, enjoy listening. The morning light slipped weakly through the cracks of a grimy window in a run-down boarding house on the edge of town. Michael Turner sat on the edge of his narrow bed, holding his head with both hands. The pain came in waves, sharp and sudden. The legacy of a night that had ended years ago in smoke and fire. Once, Michael had been a respected man. He worked as a chief accountant for a large private company. He had no family of his own. His mother had abandoned him at birth, and he was raised by his grandmother, who often reminded him that no one else wanted him. By the time he was close to 40, Michael had resigned himself to a lonely bachelor's life. Work was all he had. That night, the office was quiet, empty. Everyone else already gone home to their families. Michael had stayed late, balancing accounts, when he noticed smoke curling outside the window. The storage building on company grounds was on fire. He called the fire department, but something gnawed at him. What if someone was inside? He rushed across the lot, pushing through the heavy smell of burning plastic and wood. Then he heard it, someone shouting for help. Inside, through the smoke, he saw his boss, Alan Jeffries, pinned under a fallen shelf. Alan screamed for Michael to hurry. Without thinking, Michael threw himself into the flames, straining until he freed the man's leg. Alan bolted for the exit. Michael followed. But just as he neared the door, a support beam collapsed and struck him across the head. The last thing Michael remembered was Alan's terrified face as the man turned and ran, leaving him behind. Firefighters dragged Michael out, unconscious but alive. Alan was later arrested for arson, exposed for setting the fire to cover financial fraud. Michael, though, paid the heavier price. His skull injury left him with seizures, blinding headaches, and gaps in memory. He could no longer work as an accountant. The company collapsed, and with it, his career. Years later, Michael's savings were gone. The only thing left of value was his grandmother's apartment in a good neighborhood. The one place that felt like home. Selling it seemed impossible. His grandmother's memory lingered in every corner. But mortgaging it, that could pay for medical treatment abroad. It felt like his last chance to get better, to feel like himself again. That morning, clutching a folder of documents, Michael set off for the bank. His clothes were worn, his face pale, but hope carried him forward. As he approached the steps, he froze. A woman in a sharp grey suit was giving instructions to a maintenance worker. She was tall, confident, with cold blue eyes. For a moment, Michael didn't recognize her. Then he did. "Linda? Linda Warren?" he called out. His voice cracked, but she turned. She frowned, about to dismiss him as another beggar. But then recognition flickered. They had once shared the same classroom, the same desk, all those years ago. Linda had been the quiet girl then, the one no one paid attention to. Now she was the manager of this bank. Michael felt relief wash over him. Maybe this was fate. Maybe the world hadn't forgotten him entirely. "Michael Turner," she said slowly, a hint of a smile tugging at her lips. "Well, this is a surprise." Linda Warren led Michael away from the glass doors of the bank, toward a bench in the small square nearby. She did not want someone who looked half broken sitting inside her office. At least not until she knew what he wanted. "Sit," she said briskly, crossing one leg over the other. Her expensive heels clicked against the pavement. "Tell me what happened to you. You look different." Michael lowered himself onto the bench. His hands trembled slightly as he held his folder. He gave her the short version of the story. His accident, his long recovery, the headaches, the seizures, the loss of his job. He explained about the apartment, about wanting to mortgage it for treatment. Linda listened, nodding at the right moments, but her mind was elsewhere. She already lived in a cramped apartment with her husband Greg, who drained their finances at poker tables and off-track betting parlors. Linda wanted out of that life, wanted property of her own, something permanent. Michael's story gave her an idea. She smiled warmly, a smile Michael remembered from school, though it no longer reached her eyes. "You came to the right person," she said. "This bank has the best terms for property loans. I'll make sure you get what you need." Michael's shoulders sagged with relief. For the first time in years, he felt like things might turn around. "Thank you, Linda," he whispered. "You don't know how much this means to me." Inside the bank, Linda moved quickly. She summoned a bank attorney and her husband Greg, who had been idling in her office. Together, they drafted a set of papers that looked official enough. Michael, overwhelmed by the process and trusting of his old classmate, signed them all without a second thought. Linda assured him the funds would transfer within days. Michael left the bank almost light-headed with hope. That night, he even allowed himself to dream about a future without pain. But a week later, men in leather jackets came to his door. They tossed his few belongings down the stairwell and told him the apartment no longer belonged to him. Michael stood on the sidewalk, clutching the folder of papers, shouting that there must be a mistake. But there was no mistake. He had not mortgaged the apartment. He had sold it outright to Greg Warren. His signature was on every page. A notary seal sat proudly at the bottom. The money he had been promised never arrived. The next morning, broken and homeless, Michael went back to the bank. He demanded to see Linda. Instead, a police officer arrived. Officer Reed looked over the papers, shook his head, and told Michael there was nothing illegal about the transaction. Linda stepped out of her office, her voice soft, almost pitying. "Michael," she said, "you've been under a lot of stress. Maybe you misplaced the money. Maybe you spent it and forgot. It happens. But look, I'm not heartless. There's a vacant custodian's room behind the building. I'll arrange for you to stay there. And if you're willing to work, I'll give you a job here. Cleaning floors. It's better than nothing." Greg appeared beside her, grinning. "See? Linda's got a good heart," he said, slipping an arm around her waist. Michael's fists clenched, but he had nowhere to go. That night, he slept on a cot in a damp little room that smelled of bleach and mold. The pain in his head returned with full force. He knew he had been betrayed. But he also knew he would have to endure, for now. Michael kept his head down in the weeks that followed. Each morning, he reported to the bank before sunrise, changed into a blue uniform, and began scrubbing floors and wiping windows. His body ached. His hands cracked from the cleaning chemicals, but the work gave him a roof over his head. Most of the staff treated him like furniture. They stepped around him without acknowledgement, sometimes muttering about the smell of bleach he left behind. Linda avoided him entirely, as if embarrassed by his presence. To her, he was no longer a former classmate. He was a reminder of the past she wanted to bury. The only person who spoke to him kindly was Sarah Collins, a teller who worked long shifts to support her 8-year-old son. She was in her early 30s, plain in appearance, but quick with a warm smile. Sometimes she brought him a sandwich from home. Other times, she slipped him leftover muffins from the break room. "You don't talk much," she told him one afternoon as he mopped the lobby. Michael shrugged. "Not much to say." Sarah tilted her head. "You had a life before this. I can see it in you. You weren't always a janitor." Michael almost told her everything, but stopped himself. The last time he trusted someone, he lost everything. One rainy evening, as Michael took out the trash, he noticed an elderly woman standing at the counter, pleading with one of the loan officers. Her voice shook as she explained that her son had been injured in a car accident, and she needed more time to pay her bills. The officer barely looked up. Linda emerged from her office, heels clicking against the tile. "This is a bank, not a charity," she snapped. "If you can't make payments, we'll foreclose. Security, escort her out." The old woman clutched her chest and collapsed before anyone moved. The staff froze, glancing at one another. Linda barked an order. "Take her outside! She's faking! Fresh air will wake her up!" 2 guards dragged the woman toward the door. Michael dropped his mop and rushed forward. "Stop!" he shouted. His voice echoed across the lobby. "She needs an ambulance!" Linda's eyes narrowed. "You're out of line, Michael. Get back to work before I fire you." "I don't care," he said firmly. "Do what you want. I'm not letting you leave her like this." For the first time in years, Michael felt a spark of the courage that had once driven him into a burning building. He knelt beside the woman, shouting for someone to call 911. Sarah appeared with her phone already in hand. "I'm calling," she said, ignoring Linda's glare. Minutes later, paramedics arrived and rushed the woman to the hospital. Michael followed in the back of the ambulance, holding the woman's hand as she drifted in and out of consciousness. He had no idea who she was, or why he cared so much, but he knew he could not abandon her. That decision would change everything. The ambulance raced through the rain-slick streets. Michael sat beside the elderly woman, her hand cold and frail in his. She whispered fragments of words he couldn't understand. Fear and exhaustion clouded her face, but she squeezed his hand as if clinging to him. At the hospital, doctors moved quickly. Michael stood in the hallway, wet from the rain, watching through the glass as nurses hooked her up to machines. Beside him, Sarah appeared, still holding her umbrella. She had followed in her own car. "You didn't have to come," Michael said quietly. "I did," she replied. "Someone had to make sure she wasn't abandoned." They sat together in the waiting area. After a long silence, Michael told her everything about the fire, his injuries, how Linda tricked him into signing away his grandmother's apartment. Sarah listened without interruption, her eyes soft with pity but not judgment. "You're stronger than you think," she said finally. "Most people would have given up a long time ago, but you didn't." Michael wasn't sure he believed her, but her words lingered. An hour later, a nurse stepped into the waiting room. "She's awake. She wants to speak to you." Michael blinked. "Me?" The nurse nodded. Inside the hospital room, the woman was propped up against a pillow, her breathing steadier now. Her eyes studied Michael carefully, as if searching for something familiar. Then she laughed softly, though her voice cracked. "You've grown," she said. "So much." Michael frowned. "Do we know each other?" The woman reached up, tugged at her hair, and removed a wig. Underneath, streaks of silver and dark brown framed her face. "My name is Helen Brooks," she said. "I'm the new owner of that bank." Michael froze, trying to process her words. Helen's gaze never left him. "And I am also your mother." The room spun. Michael gripped the side of the bed for balance. "That's not possible," he whispered. "My mother died years ago. My grandmother told me." "She lied," Helen interrupted, tears welling in her eyes. "She hated the man I loved, your father. She told me I had to leave you behind. She made me believe you'd be safer with her. And then she cut me out of your life." Michael's throat tightened. For years he had carried the wound of abandonment. Now the truth was unraveling before him. Sarah, standing in the doorway, covered her mouth with her hand. Helen reached for Michael's arm. "I never stopped looking, and today, fate brought you back to me." Michael collapsed into the chair beside her bed, his face buried in his hands. Everything he thought he knew about his past was shifting. For the first time, the loneliness that had defined his entire life seemed to crack. He was not as alone as he believed. Michael stayed at the hospital the rest of the night, barely able to process what he had learned. Helen never let go of his hand. She told him about the years she had spent building her own business after losing her husband in a car accident, about how she kept searching for her son, but always ran into dead ends. "Your grandmother hid you well," Helen said quietly. "But I never gave up hope." Michael listened, torn between anger and relief. The woman before him looked fragile yet strong, a survivor. Could he forgive her for not fighting harder? Could he forgive his grandmother for lying? By morning, Helen was stable enough to be discharged. She insisted on returning to the bank the same day. "They don't know who I am yet," she explained. "And now I know who I can trust." Sarah drove them back in her old sedan. Michael sat in the back, staring at the grey buildings passing by. He still felt like the world was tilted, reality slipping beneath his feet. When they arrived, Linda was waiting in the lobby, arms crossed, her face pale when she saw Helen. She rushed forward with exaggerated concern. "Mrs. Brooks, I had no idea you were in the hospital. We would have—" Helen raised a hand, silencing her. "Save it, Mrs. Warren. I know everything I need to know." Linda's eyes darted to Michael, then to Sarah. A flicker of panic crossed her face, quickly hidden behind a forced smile. That afternoon, Helen called a private meeting in the top-floor conference room. Sarah and Michael sat on one side of the long table, Linda and Greg on the other. A company lawyer stood near the window, watching quietly. "I staged that visit yesterday to see how my employees treated people in need," Helen began, her voice firm. "What I witnessed disgusted me. Cruelty, greed, corruption." Greg shifted uncomfortably, wiping sweat from his forehead. Linda opened her mouth, but Helen cut her off. "And then I discovered something else. Fraudulent property transfers, forged loan agreements. An employee of mine, Michael Turner, was robbed of his home under your watch." Linda tried to protest. "That's absurd. He signed the documents willingly. He was confused." "Enough," Helen snapped. Her eyes were cold steel now. "You and your husband are finished here. The authorities will handle the rest." Michael stared at her in shock. For the first time since the fire, he felt someone stand up for him. His chest tightened with a strange mix of gratitude and disbelief. Security entered the room and escorted Linda and Greg out. Greg shouted insults. But Linda kept her eyes locked on Michael, hatred simmering beneath her polished exterior. When the room fell silent, Helen turned to Michael. "You don't belong in a janitor's closet," she said softly. "You're my son, and you're going to help me run this bank." Michael swallowed hard. He had no idea how to be an executive again, not with the pain still pulsing in his skull. But as Sarah gave him an encouraging nod, he realized he was being given something he thought he had lost forever: a second chance. Michael's new life began the next morning. He exchanged his janitor's uniform for a grey suit Helen had ordered delivered to his small rented room. The fabric felt stiff on his shoulders, but when he looked in the mirror, he no longer saw the broken man mopping floors. Helen introduced him to the staff as her son and new assistant. The room buzzed with whispers. Some employees looked relieved. Others, loyal to Linda, avoided his eyes. Sarah caught his glance from across the room and mouthed, "You'll be fine." But Michael was not fine. Sitting behind a desk covered in financial reports, he felt overwhelmed. Numbers blurred together. Long meetings left his head pounding. Every time someone questioned him, he froze, afraid of saying the wrong thing. One evening, as the office emptied, Sarah stopped by his desk. "You're working yourself into the ground," she said. "I don't know what I'm doing," he admitted. "I was a firefighter, not a banker. This isn't me." She leaned on the desk. "You don't need to be perfect. People here need someone honest, not another shark like Linda. Start small, listen, learn. You'll get there." Her confidence in him steadied his nerves. And next week, Helen asked Michael to sit in on a meeting with small business owners applying for loans. He watched the nervous men and women lay out their plans. A bakery, a hardware store, a family-run taxi service. For the first time, Michael saw the human side of banking. After the meeting, he turned to Helen. "They're like me. Nobody gave them a chance. That's why they're here." Helen smiled faintly. "Exactly. And that's why you belong here." But shadows still lingered. Greg and Linda had not disappeared quietly. Rumors spread that Greg was meeting with rival bankers, looking for revenge. Michael found threatening notes slipped under his office door. And one night, while locking up, he spotted a dark figure watching him from across the street. He felt the old fear creep back, the same fear that haunted him after the fire. But this time, he was no longer alone. Sarah walked beside him, carrying her son's schoolbooks in her bag. Helen stood behind him, her hand firm on his shoulder. Michael was starting to believe he had something worth protecting. And he knew the fight wasn't over. The threats escalated. First came the notes, then late-night phone calls with silence on the other end. One morning, Michael found his car window smashed, a brick left on the seat with a single word scrawled on paper. Thief. Helen wanted to call the police immediately. Michael hesitated. What if it's nothing? What if it's just a scare tactic? Helen shook her head. Greg doesn't bluff. He'll come after us harder now that we exposed him. Sarah worried too. She had seen Greg lingering outside the bank, pretending to be on his phone. Once, she spotted him following her car after she left work with Michael. Michael felt torn. For years he had hidden from the world, avoiding confrontation. But now, watching Sarah clutch her son tighter, watching Helen struggle to breathe at night from the stress, he knew hiding was no longer an option. One evening, Michael walked Sarah and her boy, Ethan, home. The boy chattered about school while holding Michael's hand, a gesture that startled him but warmed him too. At the door, Sarah hesitated. "You don't have to keep protecting us," she said softly. "Yes, I do," Michael replied. "You gave me a reason to stand up again." The next day, Helen arranged a board meeting. Greg barged in uninvited, red-faced and shouting. "You think you've won, Helen? You replaced me with your broken son, a man who can barely keep his head straight? The board won't stand for this." The room fell silent. Michael's chest tightened, but he forced himself to stand. His voice shook at first, but he pushed through. "I've been broken," he admitted. "But I know what it's like to lose everything. And I won't let this bank be a place where people are crushed the way I was. If that makes me unfit in your eyes, so be it. But I won't apologize for surviving." To his surprise, several board members nodded. One even muttered, "Finally, someone honest." Greg's face twisted with rage. Security escorted him out again, but the message was clear. The war wasn't over. That night, as Michael locked up, he spotted Greg across the street, watching from the shadows. Their eyes met. Greg pointed a finger like a gun, then disappeared into the alley. Michael stood frozen, the weight of his new life pressing down on him. He had fought to reclaim his dignity, but now he understood. Dignity came with a price, and Greg intended to collect. Michael woke in the middle of the night to the sound of sirens. His phone buzzed with Sarah's number. "Michael, it's the bank," she said, her voice shaking. "It's on fire." He pulled on his clothes and ran through the dark streets until he saw the glow. Flames rose from the building he had only begun to call his second home. Firefighters battled the blaze, but much of the lower floor was already gutted. Helen arrived moments later. Pale and breathless, she clutched Michael's arm. "Greg," she whispered, "it has to be him." Michael's chest tightened. The fire brought back the worst night of his life. The screams, the heat, the pain. His scars throbbed under his shirt, as if reminding him of what he had lost. but he pushed forward, demanding answers from the fire chief. Accelerant was used, the chief confirmed grimly. This wasn't an accident. The next morning, police questioned Greg. He denied everything, smirking through the interrogation. Without direct evidence, they released him. The staff gathered in a temporary office space. Fear hung heavy in the air. Some employees whispered about leaving. Others looked to Michael and Helen for reassurance. Michael stood before them, trembling at first, but then his voice grew stronger. We've been attacked. Not just the building, us. Someone wanted us scared and broken, but we're still here. We'll rebuild, and we'll make this bank stronger than before. If you want to walk away, I won't blame you. But if you stay, I promise you this. No one will ever treat you like you don't matter again. Silence followed. Then Sarah stepped forward. I'm staying. Her son, Ethan, stood beside her, nodding proudly. Slowly, others voiced their agreement. Helen's eyes glistened with tears as she looked at her son. Your father would have been proud, she whispered. But Michael knew the battle was not finished. Greg was growing reckless, and reckless men were dangerous. That night, Michael walked Sarah and Ethan home again. The boy hugged him tightly before bed. Sarah lingered at the door. You gave them hope today, she said. You gave me hope too. For a moment, Michael allowed himself to feel something he had buried for years, a future worth living for. But across town, Greg poured himself another drink and studied blueprints of Helen's properties spread across his desk. His plan wasn't over. The fire was only the beginning. Greg struck when Michael least expected it. Late one evening, as Michael walked Sarah and Ethan home, a black car screeched around the corner. Two men jumped out. One grabbed Michael. The other tried to pull Sarah away. Ethan screamed. Michael fought back, fists flying, old firefighter strength returning despite the pain in his head. Sarah clutched Ethan, refusing to let go. A neighbour's light flicked on, then another. Shouts filled the street. The attackers panicked, shoved Michael to the ground, and fled. The car disappeared into the night. Police arrived minutes later. Sarah's hands trembled as she held Ethan close. Michael sat on the curb, blood on his lip, fury burning through his chest. He had no doubt who sent them. The next day, Helen marched into the police station with documents, recordings, and witnesses she had quietly gathered. Years of Greg's corruption spilled onto the table. Fraud, embezzlement, arson, and now attempted kidnapping. The evidence was undeniable. Greg was arrested that afternoon. His face twisted with rage, glared at Michael as officers shoved him into the squad car. "You think this is over?" he spat. Michael didn't answer. For the first time, he felt no fear. Weeks passed. The bank slowly recovered, operating out of temporary offices while repairs began. Employees returned with renewed loyalty. Helen's leadership was unquestioned, and Michael, though unsure he belonged in the world of finance, discovered he belonged somewhere deeper, with the people who believed in him. One Saturday, Sarah invited him to the park with Ethan. They sat on a bench, watching the boy race down the slide. The sunlight caught her face, softer than he had ever seen it. "You saved us," she said quietly. Michael shook his head. "You saved me first." She reached for his scarred hand. He didn't pull away. For the first time in years, he let himself feel warmth spread through the cracks of his brokenness. Later, he visited the rebuilt bank. Workers hammered and painted, bringing the walls back to life. Helen stood beside him, her smile weary but proud. "You've come back from the fire twice now," she said. "Most men wouldn't have survived once." Michael looked around at the rising structure, at the signs of new beginnings. For years, he had believed his life ended the night of the fire. But here he was, scarred, shaken, but standing. Not as a victim, not as a janitor, as a son, as a friend, as a man with a future. And this time, he would not let it slip away. If you like the story, I would be very happy to have your support. Click the thumbs up. And to not miss new stories, subscribe and click on the bell. Thank you from the bottom of my heart, and all the best.